The Mysterious Adventures of Dr. Watson, Book 1, The Great War, written and narrated by E. Frederick Hines. Preface. We are, at least many of us are, lamentably ignorant of the leading events of even the most important epochs of continental history. G. A. Henty. It has come to my attention that many people today do not understand the events that have led to the current divides in our respective societies. This is not due to a lack of intelligence. It is rather the result of school systems which have failed them, and media, inundating them with inconsequential information, dulling their minds and robbing them of intellectual curiosity. It is my hope with this book to explain the beginnings of our current societal trajectory while providing enough entertainment to avoid the dryness inherent to educational works. The Mysterious Adventures of Dr. Watson is a drama that explores the concept of PTSD when it was first being understood and how various people might have coped with it after the trauma of the Great War, including methods such as faith, friendship, work, alcohol, and succumbing to darkness. It is my greatest wish that through this book my readers will gain a better understanding of society and perhaps of themselves. E. Frederick Hines. This book is dedicated to my elder sister, who has made loving sacrifices for me that are valued more than she knows. Also to my uncle, whose Vietnam stories greatly aided in my understanding of how men react to the trauma of war. Prologue. From the desk of J. Watson, June 10, 1940. In the few magazines in which I have been published, my readers have come to expect a certain finality which comes with my writing. I tell you of my good friend and colleague Sherlock Holmes, who continues to annoy my sensibilities to this day, and you are left feeling satisfied that the story was told in its entirety. I'm afraid, my dear readers, that I was never entirely truthful with you. In the wake of this dreadful Second World War, I am drawn to think about the naivety of my youth and the finality with which I spoke of the Great War. For indeed, at the time, we truly believed it to be the war to end all wars. Yet now, with our soldiers returning from France, I am forced to face the truth of the matter. My editor, who has had to see 2 of his sons off already, has asked me to share my experience returning from the Ypres salient, so that the soldiers and nurses coming home now might not feel so alone. Truly, it is a duty that I must attend to, no matter how painful it is for me to share these memories, though it is not nearly so painful as if I had tried to share them when I first published the adventures of my friend, the great detective Sherlock Holmes. It is true that we now know far more about the effects of such horrors on the mind than we did 20 years ago, but it is also true that someone who understands you is worth more than the diagnosis of 10 psychiatrists. So, my dear readers, with this book I present to you the beginning of the truth. The pain, the sorrow, the fear and horror laid bare before you so that those young men among you defending freedom and liberty may read them and know that you are not alone. We have seen this, lived this before, and it will get better. It will take work, which I know seems unfair as it is work that got you here in the first place, but nevertheless, it is work that will get you out. This is the hope I can offer you in this time, that you will heal, recover, and live again, as I have learned, as your elders learned. Some parts of my past are, admittedly, vague in my memory. It seems that the mind tends to wipe away certain unpleasant events as you begin to heal and grow. So for those moments, some of which will fit not into this volume, but one of its successors, I have asked Holmes to fill in the blanks, which he has done in his own special way. Certain readers will be aware that I have been attempting to convince him to write his memoirs for years, as I have not always been with him to chronicle his feats, and he always says he will eventually write a treatise, yet never does. However, when I brought this project to his attention, though he said nothing initially, a week later he gave me a manuscript containing his recollection of certain events of which he knew I had hazy memory. Dear readers, I submit to you the first volume of the complete truth of my past adventures, Great War and all. Sincerely, Dr. J. Watson. Part 1. A Study in Scarlet. A wise man once said, "A woman's place is not upon the battlefield," and I am inclined to agree with him. The horrors of war leave nothing but an empty husk where once there was a person. Though I believe this statement to be incomplete, and would add, neither is a man's place upon the battlefield. They alike are better suited to hearth and home, an addition no survivor of the Great War is likely to debate. Thus, I would posit that, while men's bodies are far more resilient to the rigors that war inflicts upon a human being, a woman's heart is better able to bear the pain of looking after those who return home broken. We women can bear up and withstand it. We can look our loved ones in the eyes as they die, then hold in the searing pain that rips through our souls so that we may tend to the wounds of a stranger. Men could not do the same for us. It would drive them mad. They can see their comrades wounded and bear up well enough, but to see a woman injured is worse to them than to be tortured in the most heinous of ways. I am both unfortunate and fortunate enough to have endured the experiences which enable me to testify to this fact. Though for your sakes, dear readers, that experience is not to be the focus of my memoir. Rather, it shall be a place for me to complain about my dearest and most annoying friend, that great detective and hero, Sherlock Holmes. My name is Dr. Johanna Harriet Watson, and I came to London the same way many Americans did, by nosing my way into a war which had nothing to do with me. As many young people tend to, I believed that every hand which could be of service on the battlefield should be there, and it was with this belief firmly in mind that I set upon my uncle to ship me there. My uncle was a general in charge of a large and not politically insignificant port situated upon the west coast. I knew with his connections I could be sent to aid the nurses. I still remember that night quite clearly. The fire burned brightly, warming the room which protected its inhabitants from the cold coastal winds. My uncle sat in his chair staring back at me, apprehension stretched across his face at the proposition laid before him. He gazed into my eyes, and finding them set, he let out a sigh. "I don't suppose your parents are adverse to this?" Expecting this response, I shook my head. "They're not thrilled about it, but grandmother was a war nurse, as you well know, and she believes it is the Christian duty of any capable woman to assist the men fighting for justice." The bearded man before me snorted, knowing the great influence my maternal grandmother held over my parents. "You're not exactly a nurse, Johanna." I knew he could get me a position in the town nearby, and had this war not occurred, I certainly would have accepted the position. "No, but I can't imagine that it would be all that difficult to attach me to the Queen Alexandra Corps." His eyes flashed, and he stood in a fury. "You want to go to Ypres? They've been deadlocked there for 3 years. "Precisely, uncle. They need fresh blood. They need surgeons. It will be all right. I would be with the nurses who, as you well know, are stationed quite far back." He gazed at me dubiously. "Johanna, you can't genuinely be asking me to send you to your death." His voice was quiet, even scared. I pursed my lips, knowing that he viewed me as his own. Thus my death would likely mean more to him than to my actual parents with their many children. "Uncle Hefner, do you not trust in God?" He glared at me. "No, Johanna, I distrust the men who refuse to follow him, through whom harm may come to you. However, if this is what you sincerely want, I won't fight you." He sank into his chair, weariness overcoming him. "Thank you, uncle." It was with this final conversation I made my way to Ypres. My uncle would soon come to regret consenting to my request, while I would say the gains were well worth the hardships endured. I was first sent to London to meet with my uncle's contacts there, and to better prepare me for what I was about to endure. The main contact in question was an English gentleman whose governmental position was irrelevant, as my uncle put it. Under his care I spent a fortnight in Britain. He explained to me that, while skirts were fine for the nurses who spent most of their time behind the trench lines, the surgeons and medics would spend a good deal more time actively in the trenches themselves. Therefore, I would need to swap my wonderfully warm skirts for trousers. There was a part of me that felt quite concerned about this change, but being a woman of practical inclination, I swiftly put any thought of scandal out of my mind. No good Christian was going to condemn a woman's use of trousers on the battlefield. That being said, there would be many long, cold nights when I would lament the loss of my petticoats and the warmth that they provided. Thus my host set me up with a full army surgeon's kit, some of which I already had, and the uniform which I would come to lament. However, I soon learned that my host certainly was not wrong. Moving amongst the trenches was much easier to do in trousers, on the muddy days in particular, of which most were. However, warmth is a thing that is easy to miss, and the familiar feminine flow of a skirt does much to remind you of home. Right before I was to set out for Ypres, my host arranged an interview on my behalf with a surgeon who had spent his fair share of time in the trenches. Admittedly, not under the most triumphant of circumstances. He was a young man by the name of Dr. Jonathan Wells, about 5'5" and dark. He had the deepest brown eyes I had ever seen and was a man who made you feel safe and secure within minutes of meeting him. This was all very impressive considering he was missing a leg. Dr. Wells gazed into my eyes and implored me not to go to the front. "Dr. Watson, if you have any wisdom you will stay in London and assist the injured at the hospital, or return to America. This can happen to you, and it is a cruel enough fate to a man, worse still for a woman." I gave him a smile. "Dr. Wells, when you first joined the war, were there any words that could have convinced you not to go?" He stared at me silent. "I'm afraid I am just as stubborn as any man. If it is my fate to be injured, then so be it. I must help." He shook his head. "But Dr. Watson, those who make it through the war physically whole are equally as injured as I. Are you truly willing to risk your mind?" "Dr. Wells, this is the war to end all wars. If we can do just that, then my sanity is hardly worth jeopardizing the security of future generations." In later years I would come to realize just what a naive belief that truly was, but Wells and I were both young, and he accepted that reasoning. "Keep that determination, Doctor. It will serve you well through this war." Thus to the Ypres front I was sent. I could tell you that war is hell, but that would be an understatement. Those who are sent to hell are sinners, those who have looked God in the eye and denied him, sentencing themselves to eternal suffering. War results in the suffering of innocents who have nothing to do with the politics involved, the suffering of those who seek to defend themselves and their basic rights. In short, the suffering of everyone, sinful or not. War is worse than hell. But I had yet to learn that lesson when I arrived in Ypres in the last week of July. Those who have bothered to educate themselves upon that battle know well its significance. I endured months of torturous labor, though not so many as others. I was stationed with the nurses, but worked with the surgeons. Some of the latter were surprised by the presence of a lady doctor, but the older, more seasoned among them greeted me with a wry smile. "We need all the help we can get. Besides, after working with her," he nodded toward the nurse who was handling my introduction, "I firmly believe that one woman in the hospital is worth 10 men." Little did we know how that statement would be put to the test. Time passed, and what was initially believed would be a short battle dragged on for months. Gas attacks and shrapnel rained down more often than even the rain itself, which, in an effort not to be outdone, turned the trenches into muddy rivers. I quickly put to work and was head-down focused on doing my job and nothing else. It creates a strange sort of contentment to know exactly what one must do each day. I would not have dared to call myself happy, certainly not in that man-made hellscape. Still, there I was needed, and that was enough. Nothing would distract me, not even cares about my own health. On more than one occasion in the trenches, my gas mask did not go on as quickly as it should have, and skipping meals began to take its toll. This, combined with the fact that my body had never preferred bread as a source of nutrition, led to me feeling mildly ill most days. In war, however, one eats what is available, and the bulk of available victuals was bread. Some of the nurses thought me near insanity when I would trade my bread for the oatmeal and other rations. On precious few occasions, a hot meal would be sent around. Nonetheless, I had often to eat bread, and this eventually proved insufficient. The subsequent weight loss did not concern me as much as it should have. After all, a plump and healthy young woman could afford the loss of a few pounds, couldn't she? Stress, as it does for all of us, began to take its toll, and I began to slow down. But still, I continued my work. Most of us were slow, and it went unnoticed. On one occasion, while going about my work, my hair began falling into my face, the pins used to hold it in place failing in their duty. In my frustration, I tied it back using a method taught to me by a friend, pulling it back into a tight knot and securing it with the handle of a defunct scalpel. This produced mixed reactions from those I worked with, the other surgeons largely finding it hilarious. There was one old salt who stated, "Between your hair and your trousers you have the look of a dandy," which was likely the result of my hat hiding the low bun from view, giving the impression I had slicked back short hair. In addition, while I wasn't exceptionally attractive, my features were notably feminine, and so it admittedly looked rather odd. The nickname soon was taken up by the others, and I was known as the Dandy Doctor. In a place where darkness reigned, this brought some much-needed humor, a camaraderie beginning to form among those who frequented our hospital in the East Salient. Then came the day where I would be forced to leave the front and the friends I had made there, not of my own volition, but thanks to an enemy we had encountered far too frequently. A nurse and I were tending to the less grievously wounded in an unused lane by the hospital, so as to keep clear the tables inside when yet another shelling came in. We heard it coming as always, yet this shelling felt different. Sparing each other a brief glance, we dove for cover, which I found at the base of an old broken wall, while she and one of the soldiers huddled at the base of the rise across from me. Neither of us made it out conscious, and only one alive. I watched as a piece of shrapnel the length of a football tore clean through her skull, and in a moment of desperate stupidity, I dove across the lane and took her into my arms, heedless of the still raining metal that would pepper my body. At some point I lost consciousness in a sea of pain and regret, never once leaving that scene until I awoke in London. While there, I was informed that one of the less injured soldiers I had been seeing to carried me to the hospital where the same men I worked with treated my own wounds. After regaining some level of consciousness, I had become so delirious that they decided it best to ship me out as soon as they could, which was eventually managed. I arrived in London with surprising rapidity considering the congestion in northern France at the time, which likely had to do with my uncle's friend, who, in the absence of my family, was acting as my guardian until my wisdom returned to me. I stayed in the London hospital for 3 weeks before suddenly regaining my senses, much to the surprise of the staff charged with my care. Apparently, I had been thoroughly nonsensical for long enough that they were beginning to despair from my recovery. My new guardian was summoned, and he arrived to find me sitting up with my feet resting on the floor. "Good morning, Dr. Watson. It's good to see you awake. I was beginning to fear what I may have to write to your uncle." I gave the man a rueful smile. "You have been checking on me quite regularly, then, I take it?" He nodded. "Well, it is good to see you, too, I suppose." The man chuckled. "That's hardly the worst greeting I've received from an injured soldier. Come, I'll take you home and we will see what Dr. Wells has to say of your condition." Dr. Wells said only the unwanted truth. "Thank God you woke when you did. Much longer and you would have starved to death. The nurses could hardly feed you anything in your delirium, and when they could, it was generally liquid." We had arrived at Mr. Holmes' estate, where, admittedly, the bed was much more comfortable than the one at the hospital. I did find it much harder to escape, being one of those grand old feather beds, with the large and heavy comforters that seem impossible to move under when one is healthy, let alone when one has been weakened. I shrugged, an impolite habit developed on the battlefield. "Dr. Watson, you must take this seriously, and I think you need to avoid projecting your worry for your pregnant wife onto me." Dr. Wells froze, and Mycroft Holmes gave me a strange look. "How did you know she was pregnant?" I panicked inwardly for a moment, realizing I had spoken out of turn. I then glanced down at his bag sitting on a low chair beside the bed, a large box of cigars laid inside among the instruments of his profession. "Ah, your cigars and your wedding ring. Fairly common indicators of pregnancy. I assume you've managed to procure the cigars early for when the baby's born?" Wells gave me an odd look. "Yes, that's quite impressive of you to notice." I scoffed. "Hardly. I'm sure you have noticed things that most people would miss before. It's a necessity of the trade. People tend to die when we miss things." Wells nodded, but seemed concerned nevertheless. Yes, I suppose so. By the way, Wells, why are you still here?" This question seemed to surprise them both, and Wells looked to Holmes in confusion. "He's my brother-in-law. This house is rather far from the bombing attacks, and, as Mary refuses to leave London, I decided to make myself useful by treating the various agents Mycroft hosts." I nodded. "That makes sense." Mycroft gazed at me intently for a moment. "You knew that his wife was pregnant, but failed to observe that we were related, Dr. Watson?" I raised my brow. "Well, yes. How was I supposed to discern that?" Mycroft smiled. "Such a doctor." Wells voiced a protest. While I was vaguely aware I was being spoken down to, but was unable to tell exactly how, and thus remained silent and confused. The next 3 weeks were spent in bed, which brought me incredible boredom. How is one supposed to cope with the pain of healing wounds when one is bored? Fortunately, it wasn't all bad. I was monitored by none other than Mrs. Wells herself, who was a bright and bubbly young woman of 22. She was kind, but in a rather smothering way, though I got the feeling on more than one occasion that she was using me as practice for her baby. The first few days, however, were a little rough. She came in all bright and cheerful. "Good morning, Dr. Watson. How are you doing? Do you feel any pain?" I, having suffered unpleasant dreams most of the night when I could sleep, was rather affronted by this bright ray of sunshine in the form of a woman. However, not wanting to be unkind, I decided to make a joke of my answer. "Only when I lie down, sit, or stand." A look of worry came over her face. "Oh, you're not supposed to be standing, Dr. Watson." At this moment I began to realize just how innocent this girl was, and over the course of those 3 weeks, the depth of this innocence would become abundantly clear. "Dr. Watson, your poor hair, the locks are so pretty, but they've suffered so." She pulled a blue ribbon from her pocket and proceeded to tie it around my head. "There, that looks better. It will distract from the undernourishment of your hair." I generally felt that she cared far too much for my hair, though much of that was simply annoyance at having to let someone else care for it. I've never liked others to touch my scalp, it having always made me tense, but looking upon this young woman whose eyes were filled with joyous satisfaction, I couldn't bring myself to lecture her. I would resign myself to being an obedient patient until such time as I could escape her smothering attention. Mycroft Holmes had made clear to me that there would be no sending me back to the front. My recovery would be far too arduous for that. However, if I followed Wells' orders, when I was well enough to sit up and work, I would be allowed to help the American Red Cross office in London. He followed through on this promise, and after 3 weeks of regular checkups from Wells, along with the constant smothering of his wife, I was allowed to walk to a study down the hall and use the writing desk there to make copies of documents delivered by the American Red Cross. The first batch was delivered by an older woman who was managing the office. "It's good to meet you, Doctor," she gave me a tired smile. "We at the Cross appreciate you agreeing to do this for us. We're so busy it's hard to find time to copy things down." I thanked her for the opportunity and for the next few weeks copied down all documents and memos I received. Much to my chagrin, I remained under Mary's smothering care. Every morning she would help me dress, despite her distaste for the fact that I remained in trousers. I was barely steady enough to walk, let alone relearn how to wear skirts, so she tolerated it. Still, she insisted upon tying a bow in my hair every day, saying it was important to retain some aspect of my femininity. Despite needing the trousers, I was quite grateful for the new corset she had somehow found for me. My old one had grown quite worn out while at Ypres, and the hospital went so far as to throw the thing out due to its appearance. Mary claimed to have purchased this new one some time back and simply never used it. The relief it gave my still healing core muscles was immense enough that I didn't question our difference in height. Some doctors incorrectly demonize the things, likely because they are men and have thus never worn such a garment, imagining them to be horribly constrictive. However, you will never hear me speak ill of such a wonderfully supportive garment. This new normal went on for another 2 weeks until one day when I was out in the garden with Mary. Against all odds, it was a quiet and sunny day, making the grounds the perfect place to take some exercise. Mary had begun to inspect a flowering bush of some kind, allowing me to wander slowly about on my own when she made a sudden shrill exclamation. "Oh!" A fright ran through me and I rushed back to her as quickly as my frail body would allow. "Are you all right?" She laughed. "Yes, Doctor, I apologize for startling you. I just realized that you've never met my brother." Annoyed at the fear now gripping a body too weak to burn it off, I decided to play dumb. It was either that or snap at her. "I do believe my acquaintance with Mycroft Holmes is quite sufficient." Mary either couldn't tell I was faking ignorance, or she didn't care. Given what I knew of her, I assumed the former. "No, silly," she broke into a cheery smile. "My brother's Sherlock. He's a fine man, and I think you would get along." My eyes narrowed as she smiled at me blissfully. I took a deep breath. "Mary, I ask this question for my own sake. You're not bringing this man up in a misguided attempt to set me up with an eligible bachelor, are you?" Mary shook her head vigorously. "Oh, my, no! Sherlock would probably take a vow of celibacy if it suited him. I would never try to set him up. At least," she trailed off with a faraway look in her eyes, "not after last time." "I see. Then what, pray tell, is the point of us meeting?" Her usual jovial attitude returned, and she grinned. "I just think you would enjoy each other's company. You're so practical, and well, you really must meet him to understand." I shook my head. "I'm not going out of my way to meet a strange man, but if you must bring him by, I won't be rude." She nodded. "That's fair. I only bring it up because there's a chance you'll never meet him. He's been ever so busy since the war began, and Mycroft has become so distracted that he's been left to handle family affairs almost completely on his own. Sometimes I don't hear from him for months at a time." I let out a beleaguered sigh. "Well, I won't bide my time then." Part 2. A few days after the interaction in the garden, a right miracle happened. I was left in the house on my own, though perhaps not entirely alone, as the cook, who stayed down in the kitchen most of the time, was in the house should I require assistance in some unlikely emergency. Nevertheless, with this singular exception, I was left properly to my own devices. Jonathan had a pregnant patient who needed tending to, and Mary had gone with him. A baby was to be born, and she wanted to help. Mycroft Holmes was rarely in to begin with. Therefore, I was left with this wonderful treat of freedom. After a few hours in my room with the books Mary had lent me, I decided to hobble about the house. I had previously made up my mind that I would become fully mobile as swiftly as I possibly could, in order to make better use of my skills. The last batch of copies had already been delivered to the Red Cross office, so this was the best I could do at the moment. As I made my way about the halls and rooms of the grand old house, I heard some faint, unexpected noise, and paused. Hearing nothing more, I continued down the hall towards my host's study when I heard it again, a distinct shuffling of papers. From where I stood, I could see nothing of the interior, though the door was half open. I froze and thought for a moment. The cook never entered the study. It was possible Mr. Holmes had returned, though unlikely, and Mary would have come to find me directly. I knew that the doors were all kept locked with the exception of the kitchen, and I had already gone by to see the cook, who would have mentioned it if someone had come in. So either someone had, unbelievably, broken into the second floor without making any noise, or, more likely, it was a compatriot of my host in possession of a key. Content with this explanation, I decided to investigate. I was thoroughly bored and thought this person might be interesting, so I pushed open the door with an "Excuse me." Stepping into the room, I saw a man leaning his thighs against Mycroft's desk while holding a thick book in his hands. I make note of this because Mycroft Holmes' desk was one of those grand, tall, oaken ones which comes to the true waist of anyone of average height, including himself. This man, I imagined, could sit on it quite comfortably should he so choose. He was well dressed, with dark hair and gray eyes that gazed out at me over a Roman nose. "Ah, you must be a friend of Mr. Holmes. Forgive my interruption. The door was open and I thought he may have returned." I gave the man my meekest smile. After all, well, he must know Mr. Holmes to be so brazen in his office. He was still a stranger to me, and I was not about to risk his anger. His eyes glanced me over, then slipped back down to his book. "There is no need to lie, Dr. Watson." Taken aback, I blinked. "Pardon?" He put his book down and crossed his arms. "I heard you walking down the hall. You stopped twice, once right outside the door. You heard me and stopped to decide the likelihood of my being an intruder, no?" Dumbfounded, I let out a breath. Well, no need to lie indeed. No one had ever seen through my lies before, or, at least if they did, they usually pretended in the same manner as Mycroft Holmes. "Seeing as you know my name already, may I know yours?" He gave a smirk and rolled his shoulders. "Sherlock. Sherlock Augustus Felix Holmes." I squinted. "That's an interesting combination." He gave a little gesture with his hand. "Father was a bit eccentric. Now, Dr. Watson, what are you doing out of bed?" I sighed inwardly. Clearly, Mary had informed him regarding the health of her patient. "I'm allowed to roam about the house as long as I'm not excessive about it." He tilted his head and raised a brow, a gesture which I would grow unfortunately familiar with. The adrenaline that must have run through you while thinking I may be an intruder must have left you quite unsteady. I was uncertain what to make of this man. He had confidence like his elder brother, but managed to come off quite smarmy. The Holmes with whom I was acquainted knew he was smarter than you, but was at least polite enough to pretend that he wasn't. This one seemed to exude smugness that just made you want to slap him. Taking this in, I realized I had dealt with his type before. It was better not to challenge them outright, especially when they haven't technically done anything yet, so I inhaled slowly. "I do believe you are right, Mr. Holmes. I'll leave you to wait for my host since I should be resting." Rather than await his response, I turned to leave, but a hand on my shoulder prevented me. "Do be more fun, Doctor. I simply expected you to be flighty, like most women. I apologize for trying to work you up." His hand was gone as soon as I turned, which relieved me. He at least wasn't going to physically restrain me like some might have. I forced a smile. "There is nothing to forgive, Mr. Holmes. You have been a perfect gentleman." I was going to attempt to excuse myself once more, but he snorted a laugh which caught me off guard. "Of course, but may I ask, Doctor, why you don't seem shaken?" I raised a brow. "You were frightened enough to freeze in the hallway, yet you show no signs of it except for caution in greeting me. Why? Your stance is as firm as can be expected." "If, Mr. Holmes, you are anything like your brother, you should already know the answer to that question." Annoyance flashed over his face. Yes, I'm certain the months you've spent at Ypres have certainly helped to desensitize you. However, most who return from war are easier to frighten, not less. I rolled my eyes. "If you must have the truth, Mr. Holmes, I was frightened. I'm a small, weak woman who would be easy to harm or take advantage of. The more so for someone stealthy and strong enough to break into a house such as this. Yet that is exactly why I can't show fear. The moment you let fear take over, you lose." I stared into those gray eyes, knowing he had succeeded in riling me up. He smiled. "Yes, I suppose that is true. May I escort you back to your room?" I shook my head. "I'm quite capable of returning there myself. Thank you." He nodded and returned to his book as I once more turned to leave. "One more thing, good doctor." I turned, half expecting some sass-filled remark. "That ribbon quite suits you." The return of my host did little to settle me that evening. The encounter with this unfamiliar member of the Holmes household had left me with questions, and I wished to have them answered. To this end, for the first time since arriving in London, I had my final meal of the day with the family. Mary was so excited I nearly changed my mind after telling her, thinking she might be too exhausting to deal with. Even so, curiosity is a stubborn thing, and I pushed on. She wanted to dress me like a doll, but I reminded her that I was still incapable of wearing skirts, so she settled for a blouse and sweater from her own wardrobe. It was less than becoming. The lady's sweater looked thoroughly strange when paired with the men's trousers, and the soft pink color did my complexion no favors. Still, she pressed on and tied a matching ribbon around my head before allowing me to go down. Mary stepped back. "There! At least you look like a presentable invalid." I followed her to the dining room and saw both Holmes brothers, their brother-in-law, and a woman whom I did not recognize. Wells helped Mary and I to our seats before taking his own. Mycroft began speaking first. There was no real need for formality here tonight. He then sat slowly into his chair, his eyes swollen from lack of sleep. He was clearly tired, and I wasn't surprised in the slightest. While I didn't know exactly what he did in the government, I knew it was rather confidential, which translated from governmental speak means stressful. "Sherlock, this is Dr. Watson, who will be staying here until our uncle is certain of his safe passage home. Dr. Watson, the woman across from you is Mrs. Hudson. She is a long-time friend of ours and will be staying here until her house can be repaired." Concern must have flashed over my features as I answered, "A pleasure to meet you both." The woman in question gave me a smile. "Don't worry, dear. No one was hurt, and I had the place insured to the gills." I laughed. "Well, that's a relief to hear." Despite her circumstances, she came off quite jovial, and I was content to accept that fact. Mary then chimed in with an excited tone. "Sherlock, did you resolve your case? Were there any vampires?" Her brother gave her a bored look. Yes, I took care of it, and no, there were no vampires, Mary. The child had been poisoned, and the mother was attempting to suck it out before the pitied thing fell ill. It is sad what a jealous child is willing to do to their own sibling, only because they do not like their stepmother. Fortunately for the child, it was only a pinprick from the poisoned dart. I was rather bewildered, but focused on my supper instead of asking questions. If what I knew from my experience rang true, I would get enough information to answer them without saying a single word. Mary's face fell.
"Oh, how disappointing!"
This took me aback. "You would rather there were vampires? I don't exactly know the whole story, but if a child were bitten, it would not take much to drain the blood from it." The entire table looked at me in a mix of surprise and approval at my exclamation, and I wished I had stayed in my room after all. Mary frowned and shook her head.
"No,"
she proceeded slowly.
"I don't suppose I wished for vampires exactly, but I do wish it were a bit more exciting than a jealous sibling."
Mrs. Hudson huffed. "I think a jealous child is more than exciting enough. He tried to kill his brother. Let me tell you, if I were that child's mother, I never would have set him up to hate my successor so. After all, a man needs a woman to run the house. Who knows how much torment that poor woman went through at his hands?" The younger Holmes brother shook his head. "Mrs. Hudson, you know all too well that I don't appreciate unfounded speculation. Dr. Watson's comment was the only factual one. But doctor," his eyes settled on me, a stern look gradually fading from his face, "did my sister ever explain to you what it is that I do?" I mentally cursed. I had not wanted the attention on me, but I had thoroughly miscalculated. My presence at dinner was a novelty, so of course the attention would fall upon me at some point. I gave my best smile. Not exactly, Mr. Holmes. She mentioned that you take on cases for Mycroft, and have been handling family affairs as well as your own. Naturally, I assumed you to be a detective for Scotland Yard." I pulled the comment about the yard out of thin air, having heard Mycroft Holmes call them fumblingly inept. I hoped that he would share his brother's distaste for the officers, and I would be able to divert his attention. It worked, in a way. He frowned. "I would never work for the yard. They are slow and far too ready to accept the simplest conclusion. I am a consulting detective. Your attentiveness is impressive, Doctor, if similar to those you thought I worked with." The backhanded compliment did little to bother me, since I just wanted the attention of the table off me. If he thought me prone to erroneous conclusions, that would be acceptable, considering I knew his conclusion was not untrue. Jonathan glanced at me in surprise. "Was that a compliment from Sherlock Holmes? Well, well, Watson, you are special." I wanted desperately to slap him and began to rage internally.
"Really? Is Jonathan so socially inept he couldn't comprehend the second part of that compliment?"
My right hand clenched, but I continued my smile, mentally talking myself down.
"Play dumb, Johanna. That will get you out of this. Oh, why did I decide to join this dinner again? Yes, curiosity. I always knew it would be the death of me."
Sherlock Holmes, the consulting detective, glanced to Jonathan, then caught my gaze. He glanced down in the direction of my hidden fist, then raised a brow. I forcibly relaxed my hand and put on an innocent face. "I suppose you're right, Jonathan. She must be." Sherlock Holmes' eyes remained on mine, his smile indicating he knew exactly what I was feeling. I hadn't lost control of a situation like that since childhood, and began justifying to myself. "Surely I'm just out of practice after being on the battlefield. That's all. Surely." Mycroft Holmes then came to my rescue, bringing up something of importance which I failed to catch, flustered as I was. She said she wanted to inquire into the affair, but was uncertain if anyone could be spared. Dr. Wells brought me back into the moment with the well-placed pinch. I gave him an incredulous look, and he returned it with a half-hearted smile. I suddenly understood. I, too, had handled soldiers who returned shocked by their experiences. It seemed he assumed me to share the affliction, given my circumstances. Apparently, the mother has insisted upon it. The brute's behavior was supposedly awful, and she wants him out of the country as soon as possible. She seems to believe that an American agency signing off on it will speed up the process. Since the Yard is likely to blame her son, it's important that the matter is settled quickly, and that's where you come in, Dr. Watson. Both Holmes brothers turned to look at me, and I was all the more grateful that Jonathan snapped me too. I'd be happy to do whatever lies within my capabilities to help. I decided upon the generic reply, partly to keep Mary appeased, as I knew she would not want me straining myself. I had already concluded she would likely have attempted to swaddle me had I been any less reluctant. Additionally, I really hadn't the slightest clue what they were talking about. Mycroft nodded. He was accustomed to my uncle and likely believed me to be as sharp-witted. Good, it will look better for all parties if an American is involved. She said if you were up to it, she would let you represent the cross officially. Between you and Sherlock, I'm certain you will be able to get it sorted. Still bewildered, I nodded. I'll do my best. The younger Holmes was smirking at me, and I was about to address him when Mary spoke.
"Oh, Mrs. Hudson, do say something! They're going to kill her with overwork. It's bad enough that she writes when she should be in bed."
At that, I was determined. Anything would be better than Mary's constant coddling. The girl was lovely, but if I didn't get away from her, I was going to lose my mind and murder someone myself. Probably Jonathan, for his insistence upon making her my nurse. Mrs. Hudson nodded.
"I agree with Mary. If she helps, Sherlock will have to drag her around London, and that would be terrible for her health."
Not certain how to combat this interjection, I looked to the man in question. He raised a brow at me and gave that same smirking smile, and I suddenly remembered that I would have to work with him. His behavior felt strange and confused me. He was clearly much like his brother, but there was something different, something which reminded me of an old friend of my uncle. It was not the time for unfounded comparisons, however. I could handle slight discomfort from a man whose position kept him from harming me. I looked at Mary, who, with her slightly showing stomach, looked quite comical as she pouted. I would not continue to be her doll any longer. "I'm certain your brother will ensure that I don't overtax myself, Mary. Besides, you heard Mr. Holmes. I was specially requested. I can't stay in bed forever. If I don't get out and get more exercise, my muscles will atrophy terribly. Isn't that right, Wells?" Jonathan, who had returned his focus to his dinner, gave me an annoyed look and sighed. "Dr. Watson is correct, my dear. You shouldn't coddle her too much or her health will deteriorate further." Mary pouted and sighed.
"Fine. But Sherlock, you take good care of her. If her health declines, I'm blaming you both."
The two elder Holmes shared a chuckle. It seemed littlest sisters are the same throughout the world. At that moment, one of the servants came in and presented a small card on a platter to the younger Holmes, who glanced at it and immediately stood. "Dr. Watson, if you will get your coat and accompany me. It seems our man was found dead." Part 3. To find oneself in a cab with a near-total stranger heading toward a dead body should be the most unsettling thing a person might ever deal with. I, however, had tended to patients at Paschadale, rendering the situation rather mundane. Sherlock Holmes was seated across from me with that strange, smirking smile still on his face, but this time there was an excitement mixed in. "So, where exactly did you lose track of the conversation?" I wanted to cringe, both in embarrassment and at his increasingly grating voice, but my manners were better than that. "At the beginning, I'm afraid. I didn't hear anything spoken up until Mr. Holmes mentioned the matron." He shook his head. "Of course you didn't. Well, Mycroft has received a special request from the lady. It seems that one of the volunteers from the supply ships has been accosting the daughter of one of her workers." I frowned. "But the supply ships aren't under our control. Would it not be more effective to go to his captain?" He shook his head. No, Watson. It is the matron with whom she is associated, so it is from her that she requested help. The man, by the name of Drebber, was staying at this good lady's home with a friend of his who had also been working the ships. She has since kicked him out, but due to an altercation her son had with him, she wanted to be certain that he would not be coming back. Realization came to me rather suddenly. "And he's turned up dead." "Exactly, Doctor!" His excitement was contagious, and my mind began to race. "What about the son? Or Mr. Drebber's friend?" He nodded excitedly. "What about them indeed? That is what we are to find out." The cab came to a stop outside of what appeared to be some kind of tenement housing. Mr. Holmes helped me out of the cab, and we came down the walkway, which had exactly 2 officers. I made note. The yard must be stretched thin, just as everyone else. Now, Doctor, don't move." Holmes left me standing outside the cab and darted about the road and up and down the street. He was slowly making his return, scanning along the ground as he walked, when an officer came out of the building and gave me a strange look. As he walked down the path, he caught a glimpse of Holmes, and understanding seemed to dawn on his face. "You must be the fellow that the Red Cross lady was going to send to talk to us. Funny, I could have sworn she said she'd be sending a woman." He held out his hand, and I gave it a hearty shake. I was rather amused at his mistake and took it as an opportunity. The coat I wore was the one I wore as a surgeon, as was the hat. He couldn't see the sweater nor the hair underneath, and I wondered if he would notice my hands. I decided to choose my words carefully. "Dr. Watson, sir, a pleasure to make your acquaintance." He didn't seem to notice the size difference and looked pleased. "Ah, a doctor, you say? Good. Ours are stretched thin. It'll be good to have someone confirm time of death other than Mr. Holmes. I'm Inspector Lestrade, by the way. What's a fellow like you doing working with the nurses? Surely they could use you at St. Bart's." "Don't laugh, Johanna, don't laugh." I stifled the urge as best I could. "I'm afraid my health is just not up to it. I was barely allowed to help on this matter, and only because we're stretched so thin." He nodded sagely. "Ah, you're pushing paper, then. She did mention something about you just returning from the front. Shrapnel wounds, I expect?" I nodded. "And the sum total of several gas attacks. Masks aren't always perfectly sealed, after all." Holmes then came upon us. "Well, the one good thing about this war is that the yard can't muck up the tracks with so few people available. Ah, Lestrade, making your acquaintance with the good doctor?" Lestrade nodded. "Unlike most of the people you seem to spend your time with, the doctor seems to be quite respectable. I'm certain he'll find a wife quite soon with his work ethic." Holmes glanced down at me, and I did my best to look innocent. "Yes, I'm sure that would be the case if she were a man." Lestrade's face became that of confusion as he looked at Holmes, then to me. It was then crossed with such horror that I began to feel quite guilty for not correcting him to begin with. "You don't mean—" "Lestrade, this is Dr. Johanna Watson. Please don't tell me you mistook the poor woman for a man. She's already self-conscious about her need to wear men's trousers to get around until her health improves. Surely you must have noticed the size of her hands. They're so small." Pleasure oozed from my companion's voice, and I decided it best to interrupt. "Please don't worry about it, Inspector. Mr. Holmes is creating an offense where there is none. If I were so fragile as to mind being mistook for a man in my current state, I wouldn't be out here to help." Holmes seemed to pout. So briefly I wasn't entirely sure I had perceived his expression correctly. So swiftly did he return to his neutral gaze while Lestrade managed to compose himself. "Ah, thank you, Dr. Watson. Still, I do apologize. My sister is in the nursing corps, so I should have been more aware that some come back as haggard as the men. As for her hands being small, Mr. Holmes, you know well that I would never comment on the size of a man's hands. One can't help what he was born with." Holmes, like a cat, pounced once more upon his mouse. "Oh, Lestrade, calling Dr. Watson haggard! I think she is a comely woman." Before Lestrade could get further worked up, I decided to step in yet again. "And I think I should get a chance to look at the dead man before his corpse rots away." This seemed to placate Holmes, and Lestrade, aware of my social cue, nodded. Well then, in we go. I was learning exactly the type of man this Sherlock Holmes was, and I was not enthused. As we came through the building to the room where the body lay, Lestrade offered his arm while launching into exposition. "We haven't touched anything. We know how that frustrates you, Mr. Holmes." Annoyance laced his voice, and my theory was confirmed. "We thought it best to allow you and whomever was sent over by the cross to do the examination of the body." I frowned. "How did you know it was Mr. Drebber if no one has examined him for identification?" Lestrade nodded. "One of the officers met him once, and we had the fortune that he was the one sent over. He called for me as soon as he recognized the body, wanting nothing to do with an American case." I nodded. If Mr. Drebber had caused as much mayhem as it seemed, I could see why he would be recognized. We came into the room with the body, and Holmes began darting about. There was a table to one side upon which rested a half-burnt candle, and in the corner the word "Rush" was written in what appeared to be blood. "Revenge?" The word came out without thinking, and both men glanced at me. "You pick up a few words on the front. It's poorly written, but it is German." Lestrade took out his notebook. "You won't need that, Lestrade. Whoever wrote it doesn't speak proper German. It's a distraction." As Holmes said this, he knelt down to the body, rifling through the dead man's pockets. He then rolled him over, looking under him and over his back. This is where you come in, Dr. Watson. I do believe he has been poisoned, but I would like a second opinion.
Lestrade helped me kneel down to the dead man. He had been a brunette in his 30s or 40s. There was nothing particularly gruesome about the body, eyes wide, showing the burst vessels in the whites indicative of an alcoholic, a small nose and sneering lips. There was no blood and no signs of blunt force trauma. I had seen far worse in the trenches, but something about him made my very soul scream. I steeled my nerves and gave his mouth a sniff, nearly vomiting in the process. Lestrade looked on in concern as I covered my mouth with my sleeve. "You all right?" I nodded. "God, this man has been rotting while alive. Combine that with evacuated bowels and you have an affront to the sinus. You are right, Mr. Holmes." Holmes looked at me expectantly whilst Lestrade made the executive decision to help me up and away from the body to where I could breathe. The smell of almonds is there, which is indicative of cyanide. Some of the Germans used it to prevent capture. Lestrade seemed shaken. "Do you think that he is in league with the Germans?"
"Don't be an idiot, Lestrade."
I was still trying to catch my breath when Holmes made his statement. "If he were a war criminal and involved with the Germans, the man who killed him likely would have been able to correctly spell a German word. In all likelihood, the word and the method of death are simply a ruse to throw us off the trail of the true criminal." Lestrade didn't look convinced, so Holmes pointed to the wall. "Whoever wrote that either used their own blood or kept some in a container to write with. Now, Dr. Watson, did you see anything like that occur on the front?" I shook my head. The smell of decay had made me docile, and since I had been made use of, I would agree with anything to get me out of that room. Holmes held up a pocketbook and sheet of paper he had pulled from the dead man's pockets. "For now, Lestrade, you really should focus on finding Mr. Stangerson. Mr. Drebber walked into this room under his own power, and I feel as though his dear friend could give us some answers." "How in the hell do you know that?" Lestrade seemed greatly confused, and I felt the same. Holmes shook his head. "Now, Dr. Watson, I would expect confusion from Lestrade, but from you did hear my comment earlier." I tried to think back upon what he was talking about, but came up with nothing. So Holmes continued. "One good thing about the yard being stretched thin is that they can't spare enough men to ruin the tracks. There were 2 sets of footprints that came down the walk into this building, and only one set leaves. Whoever killed Mr. Drebber is the one that left." Lestrade looked incredulous. "We found no footprints!" Holmes smiled. "That is because you only know how to look. You cannot see. Now, you mentioned there was a sergeant who called in the officer who recognized the body." Lestrade nodded. "He's night shift, so he's sleeping now, but I'll set up an appointment for you to speak with him." Holmes clapped his hands together. "Wonderful!" Up to this point, I had been fighting to stay with it. The cyanide and smell of death affected me more than I thought it would, and I was probably putting more weight on Lestrade's arm than was normal. "Now, Lestrade, Dr. Watson does seem like she would prefer to leave, so I'll be taking her out. Do let me know if you find anything else." Lestrade nodded in the affirmative and called in the other men to clear away the body while I switched my arm from his to Holmes, who hurried me back out to the cab. My wits came back to me, and with them some confusion, so I spoke up. "Why are we—" "Do shut up!" I blinked, uncertain how to handle this situation. He seemed angry, though I didn't fully understand why. "Dr. Watson, do you understand why you are to help me on this case?" I nodded. "So the general public doesn't panic about Americans being assaulted." He rolled his eyes. "For the American public. No doubt after all this goes in the papers here, it will be in the American papers mere days later. We need American support to provide supplies for all the victims in this war. Without it, those supply chains break down. With the cross involved, we can claim this as being taken seriously. That being said, you are of no use to me if the mere sight of a dead body sends you into shock." I blinked. "What? I don't. Dr. Watson, please do not insult both of our intelligence by denying this fact. You may not be a soldier, but you are on the front line in a brutal war. You have shell shock." His voice was final, and I, having no energy to argue with him, went silent. I couldn't have the affliction, not with the little time I spent on the front. It was a silent ride back to the house. When we finally arrived, I noted that there was a guest present. As Holmes helped me out of the cab and into the house, we caught the matron leaving. "Ah, Watson, thank you for taking this on. I have to be going, but I greatly appreciate it." I nodded, and she continued on her way. Mary then came out and looked as though she were about to say something when her brother spoke. "Mary, I am going to help the dear doctor to her sitting room. Do you think you could bring some tea?" She assented and ran off while Holmes helped me with my coat, and off to the sitting room we went. He sat me down and looked as though he were about to lecture me, but I started before he could. "When are you going to return that ring to the police?" He raised his brow, a gesture that was beginning to grow annoying. "I'm not a complete idiot, Mr. Holmes. I saw you slip it out of his hand when you turned his back over." He squinted at me. "You are an interesting one, Doctor." "What do you mean?" He put a hand to his cheek and tilted his head. "You noted the ring. You understand enough German to immediately tell what had been written. Yet you still barely have any idea as to what it is that we are doing. I assume that my role was merely theatrical and you would be doing the real work. I don't need to know what I'm doing so long as others think that I do." It was true enough. While I had a vague understanding of what was going on, I really wasn't of much use. I was fine with that because I could act well enough. It is that attitude which puts ill-qualified ignoramuses in political office. I rolled my eyes. "I'm not exactly going to be running for office anywhere, let alone London, Mr. Holmes. Still, I suppose you are correct in that it is a poor foundational ideal for a task." His squint was still upon me. "Doctor, if you are going to help me with this case, you cannot succumb to the influences of your own mind. There will be many stressful and straining occurrences, and I can't be rescuing you from them all of the time." I felt the urge to tie him to a tree. "I will do my best then, Mr. Holmes." Mary then came in with a tray. "Here you are, Johanna." Her tone was doting as she gently handed me a cup of disgustingly sweet tea, despite the fact that I had asked her repeatedly not to waste sugar upon me. She insisted the sugar would be good for my body. Her tone suddenly became flat as she handed a cup to her brother, nearly dropping it into his hands. "Here." She once more returned to me. "So, how did it go, Johanna?" I suddenly remembered why I had been so excited to assist Mr. Holmes with this task. Lies began to fill my mind, but Holmes spoke before they made it to my lips. "She did splendidly, even confirmed a poison which I was uncertain about. She will be of great assistance to me." I jumped on this opportunity. "Yes! It was quite interesting to see your brother at work. I'm excited to see more of his process." Mary frowned. "I see. Well, I promised Mrs. Hudson that I would help decide her needlepoint colors, but do let me know if you need anything, Joe." Mary then made her way off, and I looked to Holmes in relief. "Why did you lie?" "If you had been paying attention, Watson, you would know that I didn't lie. You did confirm the poison, and I do believe you can be of great service to me." It was my turn to frown. "But you were just criticizing me." He nodded. "How can one be of use without criticism? Nothing I said was not constructive. Besides, I have been at the gunpoint that is Mary's nursing. I wish it upon nobody." "Wait, so she's not just like that because of her pregnancy?" He shook his head. "No, that is just her personality. It's—" He paused for a moment. I assumed to think through his next words. "Charming, in its own way." My words failed me. Mr. Holmes was being kind, almost friendly. I had been at war too long. On the front, men and women were generally brusque or sweet, with no in-between. If you didn't like a person, that was fine, so long as you could work together. I had forgotten that one can be both harsh and kind, and that only after a few months. I smiled down into my tea as I thought of someone I knew who was not unlike this proud man. "What are you smiling about?" I glanced up at him and nearly laughed. Yes, I had seen that exact face of stern questioning before. "You remind me of someone back home." I managed to finish my sentence without giggling. "Given your amusement, I presume them to be a woman? I can hardly imagine you laughing at anything less." I nodded, and knowing my cover was blown, let out a cascade of laughter. I hadn't laughed properly in ages, and I suppose my body knew it because I couldn't stop even though it was over something so simple. I tried to elaborate, managing to gasp out my statement between laughs. "My grandmother! You act much like her." Holmes sighed in resignation. "If it brings you joy to think so, I won't attempt to disprove it." I laughed harder as he continued. "To answer your question about the ring, I will place an ad for it in the papers. If our victim saw fit to grip it so tightly, then it is likely to have value to the murderer." I, finally managing to get a hold of my laughter, smiled. "Sounds plausible." "It is more than plausible, Watson. It is probable." Part 4.
A few days had gone by since my episode of amusement. I had been assigned some more papers to copy, if I could manage, and manage I could, so I sat comfortably at the table in the study, typing and writing away. Most of the papers could be copied on a typewriter, but there were a few with graphs that I needed to hand sketch. I feel my best when I am of use, so I happily worked away, the younger Holmes having left me to my own devices for the time being, on the assumption that I was not needed elsewhere for the moment. I was thus occupied when Mary and the man in question entered the study.
"I don't see why she needs to be present. Can't you just inform her when you're finished?"
"Mary, she is a grown woman. If she needed you to coddle her, I'm sure she would ask for it. Dr. Watson." I glanced up at him as he addressed me. "The sergeant who was on duty that night is on his way. I'm not happy with how long it took to get him here, but Lestrade's excuses shall hold us back no longer. If you will accompany me to the sitting room, I would like to have you settled before he arrives." I nodded. "Of course, these papers can wait." I put away my pen and took Holmes' proffered hand to stand up. I let out a sigh. It would be some time before my health would be ideal again. Before we left the study, it occurred to me to grab the pencil I used to jot notes in my diary, and the book itself. I generally prefer the old-fashioned method of writing upon loose paper, then binding the pages together, but I knew that would be useless at the front, and had switched to the more fashionable leather book. Holmes glanced down in approval as we made our way to the sitting room. Once Holmes had me settled onto the sofa in the room, he lit his pipe. My face twitched. In America, it was considered a rather unwholesome and dirty habit to smoke. I was never certain it was unchristian, as some groups seemed to claim it to be, as it did always seem to be the women in the church who said that. Considering it was they who had to clean the ash from the curtains and windows, I could understand if they truly believed it to be sinful, despite the lack of evidence I had observed. Regardless, I agreed that it was a dirty habit. Unfortunately, it was commonplace in Europe, so I resigned myself to say nothing. Holmes must have noticed my twitch despite my silence, because he did raise a brow, likely because he knew enough of American sentiments to recognize them in me. There was a knock at the door, and one of the younger maids informed us of the sergeant's arrival. He was an average-sized man, a little taller than me in height, with dirty blonde hair and brown eyes. He looked in age to be a little older than Holmes, and he carried himself with a high degree of confidence. "Sergeant J.B. Birch, sir. Inspector Lestrade said you needed to speak with me." His eyes slid past Holmes and alighted upon me. I had already begun to take down his words, but feeling the gaze, I looked up. His face was crossed with confusion and concern when Holmes spoke. "Yes, I need to speak with you about the night you discovered the body of Mr. Enoch Drebber. This," he gestured toward me, "is Dr. Johanna Watson. She is representing the Red Cross upon this matter, and you may speak freely in front of her." Recognition bloomed in the man's eyes, and he rudely walked past Holmes to offer me his hand. "Well, I'll be damned if I'm not pleased to meet you, ma'am." I took his offered hand, confused. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" He shook his head. "No, but you and your fellows at Paschadale are the reason my brother is alive. Do you remember him? Simon Birch." "I'm sorry, I was so focused upon my work I really didn't have time to learn names." He smiled. "Well, no matter that. He would surely like to meet you, though. He said he always wished he could see the face of the angel that saved him again. May I bring him?" I, being a bit dumbfounded, just nodded. "Of course, but we really should get back to the matter at hand." Holmes seemed annoyed, and I didn't blame him. The man had just ignored all rules of decorum, and even I had to admit it made things rather uncomfortable. He grinned and loosed my hand as he sat down across from me. "Wonderful! I'll tell you everything I know, Mr. Holmes." Holmes had made his way behind the sofa where I sat, I suppose not to be undone by the man. Though I couldn't see it, I could hear the annoyance in his voice as he spoke. "Just the facts, please, Mr. Birch." Sergeant Birch launched into his story, seemingly unaware of the dig from my companion, and I did my best to write down his story word for word. "It was late. I had just been shifted to night watch, you know. With how thin our forces are, everyone has been getting moved around and assigned strange hours. So I was real tired, having just shifted, though I think I've been doing all right at staying alert. The bombing seems to help with that. Anyway, I was making my way around and turned down Brixton Road. There aren't a lot of people living there at the moment, but those that do don't always follow the blackout laws. That was how I found the body, you know, the candle that was left burning." Holmes had moved to stand in front of the fireplace, but I saw a glimpse of something cross his face. "No, we were not told that." The sergeant shook his head. Well, I included it in my report, but I guess they forgot." "Who blew out the candle?"
Both men glanced at me in mild surprise, as I had been quietly taking notes up to this point.
I did. I'll get there momentarily. Anyway, I was making my way down the road when I saw a light in one of the windows. There was a ladder leading up to it, so I assumed that the landlord was making some repairs and left a lamp burning. I was about to go inquire when this heavy-stooped chap starts singing and making his way down the road toward me. I asked him why he was out and about, and he slurred something about the pub. Of course, I'm not that stupid, Mr. Holmes. Most of the nearby pubs had been closed for hours by then. Naturally, I figured the sop had some private supply. It's not all that uncommon, so I helped him when he stumbled and nearly fell, and walked him back to the other street, where he exclaimed, "There's my house!" As drunk as he was, he had walked right past it. He had a key to the gate, so I left him to get inside on his own after redirecting him while I went to attend to the lit window. It really is dangerous, you know. He accompanied this statement with a reaffirming nod. I knocked on the door of the housing for a while with no result, so I began to think that the owner had forgot the burning light and left the house. Could have burnt the place down. I decided to just go ahead and climb up the ladder and in through the window. Jumped in and found the man. Didn't notice the blood on the wall. I was told about that later. Anyway, he was quite dead, so I blew out the candle, then left to inform the lads. One of the chaps who came to investigate the body recognized him, and you were called in the next day. That's all I know. Holmes nodded. Thank you for this information. I believe that will be all. The sergeant nodded and stood. Of course, sir. He turned to me. Would it be all right for my brother and I to call upon you later, Dr. Watson? I know that he would be overjoyed to see you. I nodded. I'm staying here indefinitely, so please do. He gave a salute. Goodbye, Doctor. Mr. Holmes. He left, and I finished up my notes, while Holmes sat deep into the chair the sergeant had occupied, and began to brood. Or so it appeared. He became silent and continued to smoke, for he had never stopped that entire interview. I was about to make my escape from the smoke. 15 minutes was far more than enough time to wait for him to address me, but as I made ready my escape, he finally spoke. Watson, do let me see your notes. I handed him the book, seeing no harm in it. He glanced over the notes, then frowned and handed me back the book. You may leave. I need to think. I, being all too happy to escape the smoke, stood and made my way out of the room. Later that same day, in the afternoon, I was seated in the study when Mr. Holmes came in and pulled a book from the shelf. I paid him no mind, so distracted was I in attempting to read the erotic novel Mary insisted I finish so that we could discuss it. That's when one of the servants came in and addressed Holmes. Old man's here to see you, sir. Says it's about a ring. Holmes nodded. Sent him in. I started to pay attention at that point and adjusted to make myself presentable. Holmes nodded at me in approval. I couldn't tell you just what I expected the owner of the ring to look like, but I was quite surprised. An old man, half stooped over, limped into the room. Holmes showed no reaction. Are you Mr. Holmes? The old man held up the paper with the ad Holmes had placed, encircled. I am. Since you are here for the ring, would you mind giving me a description of it and telling me where exactly you lost it? The old man nodded. The ring is small and silver with wild roses carved into it, the kind you would find in America, you know. I bought it for my Lottie when I married her in New England. The old man began huffing in the way many do when they are holding back tears. I lost it right along the road you found it on, I think. I can't really be sure. I'm a door knocker, you know. I'd realized that I'd lost it only a few days ago. I always kept it in my pocket since Lottie died. His eyes had really begun to tear up, and I began to wonder if the ring had ever belonged to the killer. Perhaps Stangerson had found it along the road after all, the same way Holmes had claimed to. I always keep it in my coat, and I was so worried when I discovered it missing. I feared that I would never see it again. Then I saw your ad in the paper and hoped that maybe, just maybe, you had my Lottie's ring. Holmes smiled and pulled the ring out of his pocket. Here you are, and do try to be more careful. I know that I would be devastated if I lost a precious memory of my wife. The old man then acknowledged me as he took the ring. A pretty one you are. Remind me of my Lottie. Bless you and your husband. The man then turned to make his way out of the room, and Holmes waited, agitated. The old man's comment left me taken aback. Certainly the sweater had made it obvious that I was female. But had he really assumed me to be the wife of a Holmes? I was about to verify what had just happened when Sherlock Holmes ran out of the room, not long after the old man, leaving me confused and alone. Later on, some papers from the Cross were delivered, and I busied myself with copying them down. I had explained to Mary what occurred, and asked if she knew where Holmes had run off to. She smiled as though it were obvious. Why, to follow the old man, of course.
I asked no further questions. If the old man were a liar, I wondered what could have gotten him to act on behalf of the real owner of the ring. Money seemed most probable. With this settled, I worked on for at least 2 hours. I had nearly completed the copies when Holmes burst in, obviously excited. "Watson, you will never believe what I have found!" I stared at him, waiting for him to elaborate. I did not play the praise me game with my grandmother, and I would not play it with him. I tailed our visitor for a few blocks, only to see him straighten up with a stretch. Impressive makeup. He must be part of a theater company. He then hailed a taxi and hopped inside, which I did my best to follow, but lost track of, eventually. I did, however, get the plates, so inquiries will be made. With this last statement, he left the room, likely to brag to someone more interested. In spite of what I saw as a bit of a failure, Holmes seemed rather chipper. That night, well after the supper-time hour, I was reading once more the romance garbage inflicted upon me by Mary. She had insisted that I would love the book, and wanting to humor her, I was doing my best to suffer through it. I had made it through yet another dramatic scene where the leading lady's best friend betrayed her when I heard a whirring sound. I paused and listened carefully. There it was. I could clearly hear a quite distinct whirring. I stood, walked out into the hallway, and followed the sound. It became louder as I made my way down the hall, and I remembered what it was. A sewing machine. It seemed Mrs. Hudson must be working on a garment for the baby. Ever since she had arrived, she had busied herself working and preparing things with Mary. I decided to see if she wanted any help. While I was no seamstress, I could do minor handwork. It would be an excuse not to read that embarrassing book as well. I approached the door where the sound originated. It was open, so I knocked upon the frame as I stepped through. To my surprise, it was not Mrs. Hudson who sat at the machine, but Sherlock Holmes. I openly stared, so taken aback that I had no idea how much time actually passed. Of all things, he was sewing! "Do close the door, Watson. You're letting in a draft." I did as requested. "What are you doing?" His foot stopped working the treadle, and he looked at me as if I were stupid. "Sewing a skirt, though I suppose what you really meant was, why am I sewing a skirt?" I nodded, and he shook his head. "Spending time with you in—" He paused and looked me over. "That is something of a distraction. It wouldn't be so bad without the corset, but with it—" He made a face of disgust. "This," he gestured at the skirt, "is short enough that it shouldn't trip you, and will pair much better with those sweaters my sister insists on putting you in." I was more confused and felt as though I had been insulted. "Do sit down before you hurt yourself, Watson." He gestured to the chair beside him, then once more began pedaling. "Why do you know how to sew?" I had found my words and determined I would make use of them. "I'm a detective, Watson." He said this as if it explained everything, and I was uncertain how to get him to clarify. He suddenly sighed. "Your confusion is palpable, Dr. Watson. To answer what your real question is, there are times when I have to go undercover. When I do, I need garments that not only fit me, but make me look like someone else entirely. It is much easier to make them myself than it is to commission them from a tailor and convince him not to question strange requests." So that was the reason, then. It made sense, and it calmed me to know. Seeing him sew had caught me off guard, but at least there was a logical reason for it. "Wait a moment. The skirt is for me?" Holmes let out a long and weary sigh. "Doctor, do keep up. I cannot stand to be in your presence with you dressed like that. This skirt will fix the problem." I took a closer look at what he was sewing. It was a brown wool that looked quite soft, but as I looked closer, I realized just how short it was. "Can't we just convince Mary to let me wear men's shirts again?" "No." I began to grow agitated. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, I'll look like a child. You can't possibly tell me that it's better I look like a child than a man." Holmes stopped the machine and gave me an incredulous look. "Watson, you walk with a limp and are clearly malnourished. You're hardly going to be mistaken for a child." I was about to protest once more when I realized that this man couldn't actually make me wear the thing. The thought would have calmed me if he hadn't continued his statement. "I will be giving it to Mary as she does help you dress." Fear shot through me. "You wouldn't." He raised a brow and I slumped into my chair. "Enough with the theatrics, Dr. Watson. Even if you were correct in your assumption that you would be mistaken for a child, it's still better than what you're currently wearing. Besides, you know as well as I do that as long as you are in Mary's power, you will not be allowed to wear a man's shirt. She told me where she hid them, and it is well out of your reach." I sighed. He was right. "Still, it's strange that you would make a skirt for me. We're all but strangers." "Mary is fond of you, Watson. Besides, as I said, I have an image to maintain, and I can't have you breaking with it, even if it is Mary's fault in the end."
I scoffed. Mary's fault indeed. Well, thank you then. I resigned myself to the fact that this man was the male counterpart to my grandmother.
It seemed that I would have to use the same methods to get along with him as with her. I regretted this conclusion the next day when Mary put me in the skirt. Looking myself over in the mirror, I couldn't help but notice the similarity to an angry cat that can't bring itself to harm its mistress. The brown skirt would have been becoming, had I been healthy, or 12. As it was, I looked like a gaunt orphan in hand-me-down clothes. I gazed longingly at my trousers, which I could see in the mirror. If only I could obtain my shirts again, then I wouldn't have to put up with this ridiculousness. I was hardly the only woman in London to wear trousers. All those who took up factory work in their menfolk's stead did so, though those women did not reside in the homes of British elites. I had made up my mind to get back home as swiftly as possible. Submarines be damned. "You look adorable!" Mary was palpably excited as she finished tying a bow in my hair, this time a bright red to contrast the brown skirt and tan sweater, as she had said. I desperately tried to come up with something nice to say, but there was a knock on the door that saved me. Mary called them in, and there was Jonathan, whose face looked about as impressed as my own when he saw me. "Ah, Mary, Mrs. Hudson wants to ask you about one of the baby dresses. Do go and speak with her. I'll escort Dr. Watson down to breakfast." I breathed a sigh of relief as she left. "Excitable, that one." Jonathan nodded and looked me up and down. He was holding something behind his back. "You know, if you weren't so weak and haggard," I cut him off, "I would look even more like a child. You don't need to sugarcoat the truth. I am a doctor, too. I mean, look at this." I gestured to the very visible black stockings showing beneath my skirt. "I haven't worn a skirt so short since I was 12. Wells gave me a bemused look. "Well, I suppose if you're that accepting of the truth, you don't really need this." From behind his back he produced a white laboratory coat, one which was clearly capable of covering my form. I snatched it from his hands. "Bless you!" Overjoyed, I slipped it on, buttoning it as best I could. Wells just laughed. "I know all too well that we need to maintain some form of dignity as doctors. I couldn't just stand idly by as Holmes and Mary made you their own little model." I grimaced. "You don't think it would come to that?" Wells gravely shook his head. "They both love fashion, Dr. Watson. Mary held back while you were bedridden, but now that you're up and about, she won't, and with Holmes here, I shudder to think what they will put you through if you're not careful." Wells had led me to the hallway as he spoke, making our way to the dining room. His words made the darker halls seem colder, and a nervousness crept through me. I would have said something to break the silence, but I was suddenly cut off. "Watson!" I gasped and would have struck out were it not for Jonathan firmly holding my arm. He seemed equally as alarmed, more so by my reaction than Holmes' sudden appearance, and patted my back as I tried to calm myself. "Holmes, I keep telling you not to do that. Watson and I were both on the front. You could give either of us a heart attack." My face was fully flushed. I couldn't believe that I let something so silly startle me so badly. He glanced over my gasping form. "You may have already." I shook my head and held up a hand. In my attempt to calm down, I had stooped over and likely looked a fright. Holmes, unperturbed by my reaction, glanced me over. I was still wearing men's boots, as there was nothing else that I could walk in, but I suppose the rest of me suited his impression of respectability as he gave a nod of approval. "I hardly think that one little scare will do either of you in, Jonathan, particularly as it's your own fault for aggravating the good doctor with all the horrors that Mary and I will subject her to." Wells shot Holmes an annoyed glare. "Well, it's true." Holmes nodded in assent. "Yes, I'm sure before she leaves, Dr. Watson will be assaulted with many fashionable pieces that her country upbringing did not provide for her." I squinted, then shook it off. I knew enough to know that if I asked him how he knew I grew up in the country, it would turn into an instructional lecture. Instead, I opted for what I thought was the safe option. "Where on earth did you come from?" It was not, in fact, the safe option. Part 5. After being subjected to a lengthy lecture regarding how the Holmes house was arranged, and seeing its blueprints, I was taken on a tour of all the secret passageways, which I had not been made aware of before that moment. Wells had begun to despair at ever escaping the unending explanations, while I, who would have been interested had I not been distracted by other thoughts, simply took out my diary and made notes on what was said. I have been blessed with the gift of being able to take down a man's words exactly, while being unable to recite any of what he said from memory.
Although at times I see this as an insurmountable curse, I can form memories of what is being said, on occasion, with no small effort. In this case I found such exertion wholly unnecessary. Holmes glanced down at my journal and raised a brow. "You do realize that this is confidential information, Watson?" I simply held the thing out to him, and he squinted at it. "I am not familiar with this cipher." Shaking my head, I sighed. "It's not a cipher, it's a writing style that my friend and I came up with in college. We had issues with people stealing our notes, so naturally we started writing in such a way that people would be unable to read what we wrote." Wells grinned. "Deliberately illegible handwriting, that's—" He paused when Holmes handed him the journal. "What in hell?" Holmes stared at me. "You don't write all of your notes this way." I shook my head. "Just those that I deem confidential." Jonathan had turned the book upside down in confused silence, at which Holmes smiled. "I don't think Dr. Watson's journal is in any danger of being read any time soon. Do you, Jonathan?" Jonathan, thoroughly confused, just handed me back the tome. We then went down to breakfast. Later that morning I received a call from Sergeant Birch and his brother, the latter being very pleased to see me. I found this exceptionally gratifying, as it is rare for a surgeon to receive thanks from those they worked on in the field. This young man thanked me and more, his bright eyes shining. It wasn't a long visit, but it had done wonders for my mood. After all, my patient was alive and healthy. What doctor can ask for more than that? I was settling in, feeling pleased with myself, when Holmes rushed in. "On with your coat, Watson. We have an interview to conduct." Tired out by my own social interview, I tried to protest, but Holmes insisted, as it was an interview with the woman who ran the boarding house Drebber had stayed in, at which I would be useful. So tired and suddenly annoyed, I followed him out. Holmes seemed excited as we rushed along. I am certain that many would find it odd that he obtained pleasure from a situation so gruesome, but I had seen as many soldiers love the violence of war as those that were frightened by it, and was no longer caught off guard. The male mind is one which a woman such as myself cannot fully comprehend, as close as I may come. When I asked Holmes why he insisted that I accompany him to this house, as being useful wasn't enough information for me, his answer left me disgruntled. "Watson, I find women to be wild creatures whose movements are difficult to predict and opinions hard to sway. While I am more than capable of assuaging their concerns when talking to the police, I have found it far more efficient to have them speak to one of their own kind." This statement left me frowning and confused. "You can't possibly expect me to be the one to do the questioning." He paused his step and glanced down at me. "Hardly." "Then how does your statement stand?" He shook his head like a parent frustrated that a child was not understanding the concept. "Well, I do expect you are quite capable of questioning a witness, dear doctor. I do suppose I should have clarified that in this case having you nearby should make the women in question more comfortable, if only out of pity for your current state." This last part was tacked on as I raised my brow, and caused me to glance down at my weakened, limping body. "I see." It really didn't bother me that he was using me for convenience. I was actually glad to know, so I could better play my part. "You could have clarified that back at the house. I do like to be useful, and knowing is far better than being in the dark." He patronizingly patted my arm. "I was under the impression that you were quite capable of deducing what was going on through context. For now, though, I will attempt to be more forthcoming." A thought came to mind, and I decided to voice it. "What is your plan if these women don't find me to be a pitiable personage?" "In the very unlikely event that a person who looks upon you does not find your current state to be disarming and lamentable, you are still far more qualified than I to slip into the good graces of the fair sex, as well as navigating that verbal espionage in which your gender is so often engaged." Confusion crossed my face as I took in what he said. "Verbal espionage?" "Gossip and social control, Watson. You must have experienced it in your life. Women are quite adept at the exchange of information and slaughter of their enemies through words alone. I would prefer the company of women exclusively for that reason, if it were not for the fact that so many get distracted by nonsense and enjoy meddling in the affairs of others." I suddenly understood what he was talking about. Gossip could indeed be a problem, and there were many women back home who could destroy a reputation if they let loose all of the information in their possession.
I understand what you mean by gossip, but what is the nonsense you mentioned? Do you mean things like fashion?
His neck whipped to look at me so fast I feared he would injure himself. Bite your tongue, Watson. I understand that as a medical student you are likely too busy to concern yourself with current fashion, but I will not hear such an important and essential aspect of life slandered. I raised my hand in surrender.
Sorry, I just don't understand what you consider to be nonsense.
He let out a heavy sigh. I will give you an example. When a woman decides that a bachelor cannot possibly be happy with his current state of being, and takes it upon herself to marry off her sister or daughter to said bachelor in spite of all protest, including his. I covered my mouth to prevent a giggle. I had seen that harried look before when an older gentleman had made the mistake of moving into my family's small town as an unmarried man.
I take you speak from experience, then?
Disgust covered his features. And older women are the worst about it. While clear disinterest will dissuade most young women, their mothers and grandmothers simply push their girls onto like a salesman selling an old horse. It's disgusting. He went silent, and I didn't question him further. There was no need to when I agreed with him. Although where I came from, women weren't too keen to allow their daughters to marry until they were at least 21. As soon as they hit that mark, it was a race to get them married off as quickly as possible. My mother, at least, seemed content with my intention to be a spinster. She already had grandchildren, so with that no longer a worry, she was more than pleased to brag about a doctor in the family. It was with this train of thought that we found ourselves arriving at the address of the boarding-house in question and made our way down its front garden path. It was a beautiful old London house, all stone with a shingled roof. The house door stood open. A constable beside it glanced at me in surprise but made no comment as we entered. Inside, upon a couch, were seated 2 women, one older and one younger, with Lestrade and another officer in the room. The elder woman was insisting upon her son's innocence, but stopped as we walked into the room. Lestrade nodded at Holmes. Madame Charpentier, this is Detective Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Johanna Watson. They have been asked to assist in this case due to the victim being a foreigner. Dr. Watson is from the Red Cross Foreign Aid Office, who have been gracious enough to lend her to us. I glanced at Lestrade. The exaggeration of my importance did wonders for my ego. I would have to thank him later. Madame Charpentier hesitantly glanced me up and down, and then looked at Holmes. She apparently made her decision and held her hand out to me. I'm glad to meet you, Doctor. I'm sure your office can get this sorted out. I assure you that my son is innocent. He wouldn't abandon his crew just to get some petty revenge. I glanced at Holmes and then put on my best bedside manner, shaking her hand. I nodded. Of course, madam. We want to get this sorted as best we can. Could you please tell me your version of what happened? I was told that your son had been arrested with a murder weapon, but it didn't match what I found when I examined the body. She nodded. Mr. Drebber and his aide came to my place about 6 weeks ago. Johnny wasn't home then, you understand. They said they were working with the Belgium Relief Office and would pay me twice my asking rate to stay here. Well, I wasn't about to turn down that kind of money for 2 boarders, and I set them up with rooms and keys. Over the course of their stay here, they behaved a bit strangely, always fighting, though never loudly enough that we could actually hear what was being said, and then his behavior toward my daughter started. Disgust laced her tone, and I had an inkling of why this girl's brother would want to harm Mr. Drebber. I take that his behavior toward your daughter is what set your son at odds with Mr. Drebber? She nodded. Yes. He had been trying to court Lucy for weeks, but she's a good girl and kept telling him no. Besides, she has a sweetheart already anyway. Well, Johnny came home and saw how uncomfortable he was making Lucy and said that if I didn't kick them out, then he would. Lucy's sweetheart is a friend of his, you know, so I agreed and evicted them. Holmes interrupted. Mr. Drebber's behavior was so appalling to your son that he wanted to kick him out immediately, yet you tolerated it for nearly 6 weeks. Charpentier flushed. Well, you see, sir, it was a lot of money, and none of us can really be so brash as to say we don't need it given the current circumstances. Holmes went silent. Well, of course, madam. I put on my best smile I could muster. Still, it didn't matter after Johnny came home. As soon as he saw his sister being accosted, he got rid of them both. That would have been the end of it if that scoundrel hadn't come back. Holmes perked at this. He came back, you say?" She nodded. "As fast as we kicked them out, I forgot to retrieve his key. He came back at night and accosted my daughter once more, insisting that he would take her away and marry her. My Johnny came in and saw him, and he bolted. Johnny followed, then came back an hour or so later, real dejected because he lost track of him after he had gotten into a taxi. Now he's been arrested for murder. I tell you, he didn't do it." I turned to Lestrade. I believe her story. I know enough Navy men to know that Drebber would have been beaten quite near to death, but not all the way there, had he slighted them. Madame Charpentier puffed up. "So you understand, then? Well, I knew I was right to trust you. You will get this sorted, won't you?" Holmes spoke up. "The evidence against your son is circumstantial at best, and while I do wish to speak with him first, we will likely have this settled before his ship heads out." "Bless you!" It was the first thing out of the younger woman's mouth. She had been sitting in miserable silence during the entire exchange, but hope now graced her delicate face. "If Johnny were to go to jail because of me, I don't know how I'd bear it." Holmes glanced at Lestrade, then gave the girl a kind but firm look. "Miss Charpentier, I can assure you that, should a scoundrel do to my sister what Mr. Drebber did to you, I would not hesitate to take the same actions taken by your brother. No true gentleman would." With that, we were off to the station to meet the yard's most prominent suspect, Johnny Charpentier. Lestrade informed us that an officer by the name of Gregson had taken him in that same day. This didn't surprise me. The son had been the last one to see Mr. Drebber, and was actively attempting to injure him. I was also beginning to notice that this detective work involved spending a lot of time on one's feet. Ideally, this wouldn't take too long. Lestrade came with us, and we traveled in silence, which I was more than grateful for, as I only had the fortitude to either walk or think. I could not do both at the same time. It was not a long walk, fortunately, and we made our way up the steps, only to have a man I didn't know come fuming down upon us. "They found Stangerson's body in a hotel. No time to waste. Come on!" Without a word we followed, missing Holmes' opportunity to speak with Johnny. By the time we made it to the hotel, I was in quite a bit of pain. I had spent more time on my feet in the last few hours than I had in the last few weeks, but I toughed it out. I wasn't the first to serve in pain, and mine wasn't the worst case either. We were met by the concierge who had reported the death. "It's quite terrible, sir. The gentleman was stabbed! Stabbed! In my hotel! Oh, is it quite all right to bring a lady to the scene?" He had caught sight of me, and I gave a rueful smile. Lestrade glanced at me, then looked at the stranger Holmes had referred to as Gregson. But before either could speak, Holmes took over. "This lady is Dr. Johanna Watson. She's an American surgeon who served alongside nurses of Paschadale. I assure you she is more equipped for what you are about to show us than most men." The concierge nodded. "Forgive me, doctor." I waved my hand. "It's quite all right. Your concern is appreciated." He nodded and led us to the room we had come to see. Stangerson lay in the middle of the room with a knife protruding from his chest. Holmes strode over and knelt down, checking to ensure the cause of death. He then rummaged through the dead man's pockets and pulled out a small piece of paper and a pocketbook. Turning the man over, he made a small exclamation of excitement. Underneath Stangerson's body was a small pill box, which he pocketed. 2 pills! Fascinating! Across the room from us, the word "Rush" was painted on the wall in blood, seemingly the dead man's. However, as the previous murder victim was physically unharmed, I wasn't entirely certain. As Holmes was darting around the room, examining the fallen table and chair, I began to grow weary. The activity of the day had become more than I could handle, and the pain was chipping away at my resolve. I had only set my mind to coming along, as I thought I would be needed, but given the quite obvious cause of death, I was regretting not insisting upon returning to my room. As I was about to despair, the blessed hotel manager spoke to me. "As you are assisting with the investigations, miss, I'm sure you have questions for me. Perhaps we could move to my office for those. It would be far more comfortable to answer if I were not in the same room as a corpse." I blinked, then nodded. "Yes, of course, that would be fine." Holmes, who had finished darting about the room, popped over and chimed in. "That sounds wonderful. Lead the way." In the hotel office, the concierge offered me the use of the couch intended for interviews. I gratefully sank down onto it and off of my aching feet. "I do hope you don't mind moving. I just thought it would be far more comfortable here." I smiled. "Thank you. I really do appreciate it." He nodded. Ah, Mr. Holmes, I assume you would like to know everything that happened regarding Mr. Stangerson. I will tell you all that I know. This is quite an upsetting thing to happen at our hotel, and we would like to have it sorted as soon as possible." Holmes nodded. "Understandable." "It all started about a week ago. Mr. Stangerson came in with Mr. Drebber to book rooms. They were quite unhappy with one another. They argued the whole night. They were quite adept at keeping their voices down, but several things were heard, including something about Stangerson nearly getting himself killed over a woman and having to leave Europe since he could never manage to keep a low profile." Holmes frowned. "Did you hear all of this yourself?" The concierge shook his head. "Gossip spreads through the employees like wildfire, I'm afraid. I don't discourage it, as it is all the easier to protect my maids from incidents with less than gentlemanly patrons." Holmes nodded. "Ah, carry on then." "Well, Mr. Drebber left in the night, and it didn't come back for several days. I must say, you've managed to do a fine job keeping it out of the papers." I snorted. "The atrocities of the Germans have done most of the work there." Both men glanced down at me. Yes, that would seem to be the case." The concierge seemed hesitant. "At any rate, we didn't know that he was killed, only that he had disappeared. Mr. Stangerson spent most of his time out looking for him. I do remember him saying that they didn't have time for this and needed to head to South America." Holmes pulled a paper out of his pocket and held it out to me. Taking it, I found it was a telegram reading, "J.H. is in Europe." Meanwhile, the concierge continued speaking. "That's how it's been all week until last night. Mr. Stangerson came in with being supported by a cabby muttering about Mr. Drebber. I told the cabby which room he had, and the cabby took him up. The body wasn't discovered until today when the maid went in to clean the room, assuming he had left like he had all week. It gave her a violent scare." He shook his head as if attempting to rid the memory from his own mind. "I made certain that she didn't touch anything, and we called for the police." "Did you see the cabby leave the hotel?" I glanced at Holmes in surprise. What did that matter? The concierge shook his head. "No, sir. I left the front desk for about half an hour after they came in. I'm quite certain he left, though, as the night man never mentioned a cabby leaving the hotel when he reported to me." Holmes nodded. "Thank you. I believe that is about all we will need." Holding out his hand to me, he turned to Lestrade. "You need to release Mr. Charpentier. He didn't murder Mr. Drebber." Lestrade huffed. "And if he didn't, who did? Come with me, and I will tell you." Holmes led the way back to his household's estate, and upon arriving I made my way to my favorite chair, fully intent on standing no more. That was one perk to being female. Gregson came up to me as Holmes rushed out for a few minutes, stating that he had to call for something. "I'm sorry about him. He forgets that some people aren't healthy enough for these kinds of things." I gave a wry smile. "If my pain is that obvious, you'd think he would have noticed." He shook his head. "It's not relevant to the case at hand, so it doesn't make an impression." I shrugged, unconcerned with any implied rudeness. "It's not entirely his fault. I was too stubborn to insist upon returning home. I'm afraid it's a bad habit." Gregson grinned. "Stubbornness can get you into a lot of places. It's just too bad they're not always good ones." I gave a laugh. "That's true. It is what got me into Europe, at any rate." I wanted to ask, what on earth possessed an American lady to come serve in a European war? Surely they could have made use of you in the States. "Gregson!" Lestrade made as if to scold him, but I waved him off. "It's fine, Lestrade. It's a natural curiosity. Besides, the answer is simply that I don't like not being of use to those who need to be served the most. I felt like I was needed in Belgium far more than in the States, and I had the connections to make it happen. I really don't see myself as sacrificing any more than the nurses I served with either. The Queen Alexandra Corps are wonderful women." Lestrade frowned. "I suppose that's an acceptable answer, but why don't you return to the States?" I shook my head. "The journey would be hard on my body, and the submarine warfare frightens my uncle. His opinion is that at least here there are bomb shelters and countryside to run to. Actually, if it weren't for my insisting I aid the Red Cross heads, I would be there now. He's terrified of my taking a boat and it getting torpedoed, which I suppose is valid." Holmes returned, carrying an old terrier that was near death. The poor thing was quite ancient, and I was surprised I hadn't seen it before. Mrs. Hudson followed behind him, looking quite sober, with a glass of steaming milk. Holmes placed the dog before the fire and began to speak. "Now then, if I am correct, then this," he pulled the small pill-box from his pocket, contains the poison that killed Mr. Drebber. He opened the box, which contained 2 small white tablets. He placed one in a saucer and crushed it with a small glass nearby, then poured it into some of the warm milk Mrs. Hudson had brought in, who sat on the floor by the dog and began to stroke its back. Holmes placed the dish in front of the dog, and it gamely lapped up all the milk. Then we waited. We waited for naught, as 15 minutes later the dog was fine. Mrs. Hudson glanced at Holmes, who looked confused before turning once more to the pill-box. "It can't be, unless—" He muttered these words as he pulled away the other dish and repeated the previous process with the other pill. Once again the dog lapped up the milk, but this time the dog swiftly closed its eyes, shivered, and gave up the ghost. Holmes had a considering look on his face, while Lestrade and Gregson stood confused. Only one of the pills was poisoned. Why would someone do that except to play a twisted version of Russian roulette? All of the men turned to me. "How do you know what Russian roulette is?" Lestrade was clearly dumbfounded. I had a brother that liked to teach his siblings inappropriate games. He would put a bunch of identical cans onto a spinning table and covered them with a sheet and spin them round. Most were empty. One was full of worms. The 3 gentlemen in the room looked disgusted at this explanation, but Mrs. Hudson actually laughed. "Sounds about right for a little boy." I decided not to mention that the brother in question had been 16 at that point. Holmes shook his head. "I do believe you may have a point, Watson." "About Russian roulette?" He nodded. "Rather something like it. The killer was likely playing some kind of game with his victims. Stangerson refused to play and was stabbed instead. Whatever the point of the game was, vengeance was part of it." Gregson looked like he was about to ask a question when there was a knock on the door. A little boy of about 10 came inside. "We've found the cabby you asked for, sir." Holmes smiled. "Very good, William. Please ask him to come assist me with my luggage. I've far too much to bring it out on my own." William seemed to be the only one unfazed by this odd request, and he ran back out the door. "Going on a trip, are you?" Lestrade's sarcasm was evident. "It does look that way, doesn't it? Gregson, your handcuffs, please." Gregson was clearly puzzled, but turned his handcuffs over to Holmes, who slipped them into his coat sleeve. He pulled a large suitcase, seemingly from nowhere, and then there was a knock at the door. A large cabman came in, and Holmes, who was seemingly entranced by a paper on the desk, pointed at the suitcase. "It's there. Do take it down, please." The cabman said nothing and bent down to take the suitcase, but as he laid his hands on it, Holmes slipped cuffs onto his wrists. "Sir, you are under arrest. Gregson, Lestrade, this is your murderer, Mr. Jefferson Hope." Part 6. Mr. Hope, to his credit, did not resist. He had glanced about the room, surprised but calm. "There's no need to keep your hands on me, sir. I know when I'm done. I've finished what I set out to do anyway. But how did you know?" Gregson looked as dumbfounded as I felt. "That's what I would like to know." Holmes smiled. "This man before you is Jefferson Hope, the American that killed both Drebber and Stangerson. Drebber by convincing him to take poison, and Stangerson by stabbing." Lestrade looked mildly annoyed. "We can see that he is your primary suspect, Holmes. Even I'm not so unobservant that I wouldn't acknowledge his blatant confession. Still, why in hell did he kill the men?" Hope looked at me and smiled. "I'll gladly tell you, officer. I'm a dead man anyway. If you would, doctor." He gestured for me to put a hand upon his chest. I glanced to Holmes, who gave a near imperceptible nod. Then I did as requested, laying my hand on his chest. I felt it beat for a few moments. I felt that irregular pulse indicative that something was wrong with his heart. I frowned. "Holmes, get my stethoscope." Before Holmes could comply, Hope put his hand over mine. "That's not necessary, doctor. I know well what I have. The aneurysm will likely kill me soon." Releasing my hand, he turned to Holmes. "I'm impressed that you were able to trace me. I had thought that I covered my tracks well. But that does not matter any more. Those evil men are dead, and I will take any punishment the English government deems fit. Should I survive long enough to do so, of course." Holmes nodded. "I'm sure you have been through a great deal, losing the woman you loved to that man." Lestrade and Gregson looked perplexed. "Holmes, do fill us in on what this is." It was not Holmes that answered, though. "I am more than content to tell you my story, officer. That is, if you'll allow me to sit down. If I die in the middle, then you may not get all the answers you seek." Holmes quickly drew the man a chair, and he launched into his story. In 1907, a new doctor had recently begun his practice in a small town in Utah. Jefferson Hope was a pragmatic, practical man, having worked his way through medical school. He was excited to start life in this new little town. He set up in an old house, half being reserved for his office and patients, while the other half became his living quarters. A fine setup for a new doctor. Lucy Ferrier was the beauty of the town nearby. Everyone knew that multiple men were vying for her hand in marriage, and that fact surprised no one. What did surprise everyone was the fact that she was not yet married. Everyone, that is, except her father. Lucy's father was a fine, upstanding man in his church. Rather, he was the only upstanding man in his church. As such, he was not fond of the idea of Lucy marrying anyone within any of the surrounding towns. Lucy, not much fond of the men around her either, was content with this. The Ferriers visited the doctor's office in the town near them one afternoon. John Ferrier, having been suffering from a cough for some weeks that he couldn't seem to shake. This is where they met the young Dr. Jefferson Hope. Dr. Hope examined John in silence, then launched into his diagnosis. "It doesn't seem to me like you have pneumonia. It's likely the dust in the air that's bothering you. It can inflame the lungs and make people feel stuck. But there's an old native remedy that helps. Make tea out of stinging nettles. It soothes the irritation. In the meantime, I'll send you off with some of this cough syrup. It should start to take effect right away."
"Oh, thank Providence, I've been so worried."
Lucy very often worried about her father, much to the older man's annoyance. "I told you that it wasn't anything to be worried about, Lucy. You fret too much. It'll be the death of you." Dr. Hope smiled. "I don't see that there's anything wrong with a daughter being concerned for her father's health." Ferrier waved him off dismissively. "You would be saying very different if it were you held at gunpoint by my Lucy's fretting." Hope continued to smile, but only at Lucy. "I don't think I can agree with you, sir. I really don't." John Ferrier was not an unobservant man. He hadn't survived this long in the social nightmare that was his church purely by chance. The heads of the church had been pressuring him for far too long that it was time for Lucy to get married, and there were two men in particular that they had in mind: Joseph Stangerson and Enoch Drebber. Now the church did technically have their hands tied. They were too far away from the bulk of the church's land and too near a disassociated town to just force the issue. Nevertheless, this was rural Utah. Anything could happen, and he had to be ahead of the local leaders. Dr. Hope was a traditional Protestant, so it would be of no small benefit if he could woo Lucy. He could get them out of their church-ruled town. Like many things, social escape is tricky and must be played out carefully. Ferrier was a well-off man. It was his crops that did the best, his herd that produced the greatest income. The leaders of his church wanted his daughter to marry one of their sons to inherit that wealth, but law was law, and they couldn't just force it, so social pressure ensued. In the meantime, Ferrier began to visit the neighboring towns, doctored just as often as he could justify. It paid off. Lucy fell for the young doctor and agreed to marry him. Thus Ferrier laid plans. He had already been selling more and more of his cattle, and he laid out a will. Half of his property would be bequeathed to his daughter after his death, while the other half would go to the church. It was his hope that the church would see this and begin to look in other directions. But greed is stubborn, and it encompasses not only money, but all things. On the day Lucy was to be married to Hope, she disappeared. She and her father had made it to town and had gone straight for the justice of the peace to have her married, but they never made it there. Hope and the justice set out to look for them, and in an alley they heard a cry and found John Ferrier laying there. Ferrier was out of his wits, and they took him straight to Hope's office. There he managed to spit out the words, "Stangerson! He took Lucy!" before losing consciousness. Hope and the local sheriff were able to form a posse to spread out and look for Lucy and her kidnappers, but they could not be found. Days passed, and the sheriff spoke to Stangerson's family, finding that the young man had disappeared on the same day as Lucy. "Sheriff, I assure you that we have no knowledge of where our son is, but it is unlikely he has anything to do with Miss Ferrier's disappearance. He felt rather jilted by her and was pursuing another young woman in our church." The head priest of the church was careful with his words. In an effort to protect his daughter, John Ferrier had not allowed her to be away from him, yet she had been taken, and he injured, which had not been what was agreed upon. The sheriff, having deliberately left Hope out of this conversation, simply requested that should the head priest find out anything, he be informed. After all, one cannot act rashly amongst such hostility. It was several days after this that Lucy was found. One of the members of the posse mentioned that there was an old hunting cabin up in the mountain which was owned by no one. If they hadn't left town, they could be there, and there Lucy was found, still and cold. A doctor was called in to examine the body, as Hope was in no state to do it himself. She had been violated harshly. Her skin had been torn so aggressively that it was more than apparent. Her engagement ring had also been taken, ripped off her finger so violently that there was a severe bruise. The examining doctor shook his head. What kind of man can think himself so entitled to another's soul that he would kill her just so that another could not have her? John Ferrier did not survive long after hearing news of his daughter's death. Grief over what is lost very often kills those among us who do not have the strength to carry on through such shock. Stangerson and Drebber were never seen in that town again, and Jefferson Hope disappeared not long after them. These events strained relations between the two towns beyond the breaking point. The Protestants and Catholics alike blaming that denomination to which Stangerson belonged. It was not long before that hated church's local temple was dissolved. Upon hearing this story, Gregson and Lestrade looked horrified, while Holmes looked stoic. Holmes spoke to fill in the rest for Hope, who had paused to catch his breath. "And you have been hunting Stangerson and Drebber ever since?" Hope nodded. "Stangerson kept the ring I gave Lucy as some sort of prize, I suppose. I had thought to retrieve it, but I wound up leaving in such a hurry that I managed to miss it. It was a friend of mine that retrieved the ring for me. He's an actor by trade, but he's a baker at the moment, so he can be of use to his country. He was more than happy to play the role to obtain the ring." "Why did it take so long to track them down?" Although Lestrade had spoken, I also wanted to know the answer. "I had to work. I managed to chase them across the U.S. to the East Coast. Then the war broke out. I guess they saw a good chance to get away. With the way my health is, it took ages to find a ship that would take me to Europe. I had to bribe the captain at that." Holmes raised a brow in question. "I assume the men in question were being funded by their less-than-moral fathers?" Hope nodded. "Exactly." Gregson decided to interrupt. "Excuse me, what church would allow such awful behavior?" Holmes laughed. "Have you seen the history of the Catholic Church? But I do believe that Mr. Hope is referring to the Mormons." I had cut Holmes off, causing the men to look at me, so I explained more clearly. "The followers of Joseph Smith. They claim to be Christian, but many of their beliefs tend to contradict what Christ said." Hope smiled wryly. "You've experienced them, then?" "My aunt married a man who forsook that church. He had to run as far as the West Coast before he was given peace." Lestrade and Gregson seemed content with that answer. "Where did your aneurysm come from?" I had wanted to know from the beginning, but didn't want to interrupt the more important proceedings. "They show up every so often, my family. Likely the stress I went through triggered mine." I nodded. Aortic aneurysms had a nasty way of just existing, and then showing up to kill a body when they least expected it. "Well, if I have answered all your questions, I wouldn't mind being taken in. I am more than ready for a good, long rest." "All in due time, Dr. Hope. But why a cabby?" Hope looked surprised. "I'm shocked you have to ask, Mr. Holmes. Being a cabby is perfect for hunting someone down. There's a good chance that you'll run into them, and you can learn the territory." "I suppose that is how you found Drebber, then?" Hope nodded, and Holmes continued. "Then why the 2 pills?" Hope's face grew dark. "They didn't respect my Lucy. She chose me, and they ignored her right to make that choice." They forced themselves upon her. I wanted them to squirm, so I gave them more of a chance than they gave her. Take the pill and accept the risk, or I would kill them then and there. Holmes looked thoughtful. And Drebber took the risk while Stangerson did not. Hope sighed. I believe Stangerson thought himself capable of winning a fight, but I had a knife, and he did not. Fair enough, Doctor. Gregson, Lestrade, you have your man. You may take him away now. Jefferson Hope did not last even another 2 days. I have always had a theory that we all need something external to keep us alive, and as soon as we lose that reason for living, the body ceases to function. Jefferson Hope reaffirmed that belief. The whole affair was in the papers not long after Hope's death. The article painted him as a wronged hero who sought well-deserved vengeance for the wrongdoings of Stangerson and Drebber. What really surprised me about the article, though, was that it was credited as being solved by Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard with the help of Dr. Watson representing the Red Cross. Upon reading this, I hurried as best I could to the sewing room, where Holmes sat busily working away at something. "What is this?" I threw the paper down onto his work. "A newspaper," he had the audacity to answer me dryly. "Yes, Holmes, I can see that, but why am I mentioned in it?" "This, Watson, is why you need to pay attention when my brother is asking a favor of you." He had a smug and chiding tone, and I felt my back muscles tense in annoyance. "What did I miss?" He smiled. "As Mycroft explained at dinner, he has an influence on what stories make it into the paper. In this case, we needed to ensure that the people didn't go into hysterics over a local murderer. As Madame Charpentier had already appealed to her contacts in the Red Cross to look into the matter of these poorly behaved volunteers, it was decided that the Red Cross should investigate the matter of his death. But we didn't know that he had been killed until after dinner." Holmes gave an odd smile at this statement. "True, we didn't." His strange stressing of "we" unnerved me. "Still, why am I in the paper?" Holmes sighed, exasperated. "The matron and Mycroft asked you to look into it, remember? You were to be the de facto face of the cross. As such, it was to be your name credited in the paper." I cursed. Of course it was. I had been so stupid. No wonder Holmes had been needling me about not paying attention. Do watch your language, Doctor. I'm not fond of the foul type. I squinted at him before sighing and giving in. My name being in the paper wasn't exactly that big of a deal. It would give Mother back home something to brag about at any rate. I looked to Holmes' project, which he had resumed, and realization struck. "Is that for Mary?" "She does have eyes!" I, not appreciating the comment, huffed. Mary was not yet very large, but would likely need other garments soon. I recognized the pattern Holmes was sewing for what it was. "I do have a niece, you know, and I assisted in her birth. I know what a pregnancy garment looks like." "I'm sure you do, Dr. Watson, but you know that was not what I was commenting on." "Why do you sew?" Holmes glanced up at me. "I believe I already explained that." I shook my head. "Why do you sew for others?" He frowned at me. "I enjoy it, Doctor. Before this war broke out, cases would either be one after the other, or very few with long intervals between them. I tried several ways to rid myself of the boredom, and only found 2 which worked: opioids and sewing." He had stopped sewing once more, and looked me dead in the eye as he spoke. A shudder ran through me as I thought of what narcotics can do to a mind when used improperly. Mary found out what I was doing, and made me promise to sew whenever I was bored, so that is what I do now. Still, it is the act of designing and fitting that I find more stimulating than this. He gestured at the machine before him, though I will admit I find it to be quite soothing. Guilt ran through me. A nasty habit I have is taking the responsibilities of others upon my shoulders. I feel as though their shortcomings are somehow my fault, and in this moment that feeling was severe. Why? I couldn't be certain. Perhaps it was how much he reminded me of my grandmother. Perhaps that's just how I was. Either way, I had a request for the man. "Do you think you could turn my shirts into something more flattering?" He smiled at me. "There's no need to feel pity, Dr. Watson. My shortcomings are mine to deal with." I shuffled in place. "Still, Mary won't give them back, and they're warmer than these blouses." He began sewing once more. I suppose I could do something about them. At the very least, I can take them in so you have better range of motion. He glanced me over. You could do with another skirt as well. He paused in thought, and I wasn't sure if I should say anything. Then a thought came to mind. Would it be possible for me to accompany you on your next case? He laughed loudly. Mycroft was right about you, Doctor. What is that supposed to mean? Take no offense, Watson. He simply suspected that you liked some excitement. Very well. You may accompany me next time. Just make certain you bring your revolver. I felt it was best not to ask how he knew about my revolver.
This audio-blended special release of The Mysterious Adventures of Dr. Watson has been brought to you by Historical Literature for All, a channel owned by the author E. Frederick Hines. Digital and print editions of the book can be purchased on Amazon.com. Digital and vocal audio only editions of the book can be purchased on Google Books. Thank you for tuning in and supporting your local indie authors.